Welcome, Silhouette Gaming, of course. Good to have you on here. Like, we're going to be talking about some interesting things today. Like, you've been making some videos, some content, some takes about the place, about Guild Wars 2, about buying raids, all sorts of stuff going on. And I guess like a good place to start would actually be introduce yourself. Tell people like what's going on.
Oh, so yeah, I am a YouTube content creator. I do not do Twitch or Twitter or anything else like all the other creators do. I'm literally just on YouTube. I'm just a dude who makes YouTube videos. That's it. I play Guild Wars 2, OG player from launch, and been a longtime viewer of Teapot, Nike, Sneb, all these guys. I remember the good old days when it was Nike and Brazil doing all the dooming, but you know, since Brazil left, I had to pick up the mantle and you know, bring some of that back.
Very nice. Love to see that. And I guess like I think a good first point of discussion would actually be like, what's your take on the state of the game, like where the game is at right now, and kind of the thing that gave you the rise to prominence, the emergence, the bursting forth onto the scene was actually a video kind of talking about content creation. I kind of talking about kind of veterancy in the game and the community around the game. It was, you know, there was some multifaceted commentary within the video in that regard. Like, what do you think is happening? Like, what do you think? Where do you think the game is at right now, and what's going on with Janthir Wilds and stuff?
Okay, so I have real high hopes for Janthir Wilds. It's cautious optimism, because the end game content that has been released in Soto was like absolute garbage. But as far as giving, you have like three communities that you need to cater to as ArenaNet. You have the end game players like myself, yourself, that have done everything in the game that there is to do, and you need to give them new things to do. And then you also have new players that are looking to either return to the game or get involved in the game, and you need to give them something to do without turning them off by saying grind 8 million rifts. You know what I mean? So it's kind of a problem with the horizontal progression, and I feel that the developers to some degree have kind of lost the plot, where, you know, your core tenet that you're supposed to deliver from a video game is fun, right? You're supposed to have fun playing this thing.
Yep.
And then you got to figure out a way to get money for providing that, you know. And with the state of the game as it is, I find that my experience was I bought Soto. I realized that there were no new features, so I went and unlocked Weapon Master, and then I, you know, tried out a couple of different builds and saw what they did, and then I went back and played all the content that's been out for the last 5 years. So it's
not so much of the new stuff then.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, obviously you explore the metas and you say like, oh, hey, can you make any kind of gold? Can you capitalize on being fresh to the scene of the new X-Pack? You know what I mean? I know that whatever the Cryptus motivations and stuff like that were real valuable at first. You could kind of capitalize on being first on the scene. But for the most part, the community is in a kind of a bad place. And I feel like a lot of the veterans and a lot of the content creators, you don't see anybody engaging with that content. And that's like horrible, because ArenaNet's trying to market Soto, and then anybody that gets interested in Soto, like they'll see an Instagram post or something, and then what do they do next? They go to YouTube and they type in Soto, and they just see every content creator's video going, "This is ass."
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting place to be, because like Soto, of course, is like this new strategy, this kind of new business model and development model that ArenaNet are going for. And yeah, like some things, it's very interesting. Like, the way that I think about Soto is that it did a lot of things right, but also kind of some really important things didn't go so hot, right? Like in terms of like improving the game with like the core features. If you see this in all the posts they do, they always talk about the core features and how they improved that, which is absolutely 100% true. But then they also released, the content is a little bit meh, to be honest, like with some issues in that regard. And Soto, I feel like really the first expansion to kind of get the story crowd disappointed, actually. Like, that's when one thing that I think has been pretty solid. And I think that's why Soto is truly different, actually, in terms of the way the community is interacting with it. I think every single Guild Wars 2 expansion, like, no matter what, people have enjoyed, like, the story and playing through all of that stuff. Like, even though if there's been some issues, right? And maybe the PvPers are crying, and right, and like the raid scene is crying, right? They're all, they're permanently in tears, all that kind of stuff. But, then when, like, the story players are a little bit disgruntled, I think that actually is a little bit special. It's almost reminiscent of the Icebrood Saga, right? Like the Icebrood Saga, I feel like was the other time where the story crowd were not served very well, and that's like the that's ultimately where the majority of players are. Because I think you're really right, and you talk about this like in your video as well. Like there almost is this weird disconnect, right, between I think a lot of content creators and the actual player base at large. And weirdly enough, I actually think it is a one-way disconnect. I actually think content creators are incredibly aware that most players are new, and therefore a lot of the issues that affect them don't affect the majority of the player base. That's why so much Guild Wars 2 content is guide content and not talking about kind of issues in the game, because ultimately it's kind of not relevant to that many people within the player base, right? And therefore, like, having a conversation about it is like pretty difficult, actually, because like a lot of players just won't really understand like what the issue is, because you don't really run into it until you've been playing the game for a good chunk of time. I think, and this does make discourse around the game very, very difficult, and it's why you often see content creators. I think it's slightly unfair. Like, some people say it, and like if you read like Tea Time comments, it's actually really funny, or like my YouTube comments. Half of the people who react negatively will say, "Wow, you despise Guild Wars 2. Why don't you fucking quit the game, loser?" Right? And then the other half will say, "You are an ArenaNet shill. How dare you say anything positive about the game?" So I've got to be doing something right there. But yeah, like this happens a lot, right? And like, so where I was going with that is, I don't think people necessarily avoid talking about some of these issues. It's just that I think people prefer not to. And by the way, I kind of include myself in that category, certainly more of late. Like, people who know me, like, over the years, like, especially something like Tea Time, like, we have always, like, just, dove straight in headfirst and said, you know what? It's shit, right? Or do whatever. But now I actually find myself a little bit more reserved in that. Not only because I have, I want to say like oh yeah, go ahead. I've monologued long enough.
One of the things that was kind of brought up is the disconnect between the content creation community and most of the talking heads, right? So most of the talking heads, I feel, have some kind of community, and pre-stream I mentioned that Teapot's kind of like the overlord. Somehow you have monopolized the Guild Wars 2 community. Hardstuck, like, say what you want about Teapot, but stupid is not one of them, right? Like, you have somehow monopolized the entire Guild Wars community into Hardstuck. But even talking with Sneb and Skane Gang, or Sab and the Gabers Haven, or the variety of other large Discord-based communities. And then they get on there and they'll say stuff like, "Oh, anybody can complete this content and anybody can do this." And then I feel like one of the terms that have been thrown around recently, especially on your stream, was the idea of the mid-core gamer.
Yep.
Right? The mid-core player. And I feel like that best defines who I am, where I am an end-game player. I can play any build in the game. I've got every legendary and every hole, you know what I'm saying? But it's when I say stuff like, "Oh, I thought Dagda CM was appropriately balanced. Was it bugged? Sure. Was it boring? Sure. But as far as difficulty, you can pug it." And that is where the vast majority of players are in the game. Like, the end game community, the end game player, people who consider themselves to be a veteran or an end game player, they're gonna be in the LFG, and that is severely neglected. And then with the content release, that's with Janthier, I'm excited that they said, hey, we're going to do open world meta stuff. We're going to do normal mode instance content. We're going to do challenge mode content and then LCM. And the distinction between those difficulty tiers needs to be clearly defined and then consistent, because we all know that the CMs in the game right now, some of them are dog shit easy, some of them are very challenging,
Yeah.
where it's like static required. You know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah, for sure.
And I have no problem saying LCM, Cirrus LCM, which you had mentioned in the last tea time, was unintentional. It was unintentionally created. Um, that skill level, that difficulty mode, can be catered towards the end game community that have statics, that have communities that want that brick wall to grind against. And then have the CM be for the mid core. Have it be puggable to where you can throw the pugs together. You can pull for an hour and a half and get the clear. And then have the normal mode be for more entry level folks. And I think that the lack of that in the current end game either dissuades people entirely, because they'll go in, and I feel that it was brought up on Sneb's podcast, but the Anka CM level, or even Anka CM with special achievement, and Dagda CM are probably the sweet spot, where there's a couple of mechanics. You could have 3-4 people assigned to mechanics, and then have your DPS just do what DPS does. And then yeah, I feel like the content creator community is kind of in a bubble, because they have this community privilege where they have the ability to throw together statics. They have the network and the connections with the end game players. Whereas a lot of people, like, even if you throw a static together, like 99% of statics are garbage. Like, they just are.
Yeah,
So-
it's funny actually, because I am definitely at the point right now. If someone comes to me and says, "Hi Teapot, I want to get into raids," right? And especially if they kind of mention, "Oh yeah, I want to do like the hard, I want to do like challenge modes, I want to get into this kind of stuff," I would never say pug ever. That's just not something I would ever recommend. I would always say, yeah, you got to go on these Discords, you got to get involved in these communities. Otherwise, you're probably going to have a bit of a rough time. And you know what? I am of the opinion that is incredibly problematic, because that's just not the way that that's not the way that I think especially mid-core players kind of want to engage with the game in general. I think a pug scene is really, really important, like for anything stuff like this. And I do think that, yeah, Guild Wars 2 is a little bit unpuggable right now, like because of kind of like the community size, but also, yeah, like there really isn't. There's not that much content that kind of falls into that sweet spot, right? Like, you do have raids, to be fair. I think raids are definitely very, very puggable, but certainly the more modern Guild Wars 2 content, the strike mission-oriented stuff, like, it's kind of pushing it, I think, in terms of, like, what you can kind of get done. I think, Kindling Overlook is just about doable in pugs, but, like, when you get up to, when you're kind of looking at Ceres, like, yeah, okay. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
unit strat is pretty damn good, to be honest. Like, but well, not. I didn't mean that unit strat, by the way. I meant their actual strategy. Yeah. But with that one, yeah.
But it's we talk about the state of the community, and how the vast majority of people are new players, and then they'll play, and then they hit if you want open world easy legendary armor, go grind these rifts for forever. I think that having that instance content that is of those difficulty tiers that are clearly defined and kind of consolidated across the different, whether you're talking strikes, raids, fractals, or so on, I think that is arguably the best way to filter people into the ultimate end game LCM level stuff, because you'll have people that engage with the normal mode and say, yeah, we want something harder, and then you'll be able to pug into the challenge modes, and then the people that are content with that will stay there, like myself, and then the people that want more will then start looking into statics and these communities and stuff. And it is a good way to, I guess, keep people in the game instead of just like you go from normal mode, oh, I want something a little harder, to, hey, I need to join a Discord community and then set up my Friday nights, block off my schedule to prog, and that is not something that people are really willing to do unless they kind of get scaled into it. You know what I mean? You need a gateway drug.
Yeah, I think that the pug scene is like ideally like your entry point. I definitely think that there are definitely players who prefer to have something that is kind of scheduled. So like, oh yeah, I can block this out and I can kind of assign this. I'd even say that ends up being kind of more popular in Guild Wars 2, I think, than maybe it is in other games, because I think the player base is actually a little bit older than other MMOs. Like relatively speaking, so people are a little bit people kind of really want that kind of structure, I think, to kind of oh yeah, I can block off a couple of hours here, right, to kind of get this done. But yeah, I kind of want to re-rail here a little bit, actually, because there's something that I was really curious about your take on. I think that what we're kind of talking about here a little bit, and we span off into pugs and statics and all this kind of stuff, actually, is that, like, I feel like the middle class of Guild Wars 2 has like completely collapsed, right? Like that's kind of like the way I see the game right now, like this mid-core group of players. I think in a lot of ways it's shrunk and kind of folded a little bit over time. And I do think that this actually not only causes some problems like within these game modes at the end game, I also think it really feeds into like content creators kind of getting a little bit disengaged with the game, right? And like ultimately, of course, those mid-core players being disengaged, because I think that content creators usually fall into that kind of mid-core category, right? And like that is, I think, why you do see on the content creation side and kind of in the discussion forums about Guild Wars 2, there is this buildup of apathy, right? Like there is this huge, like, oh, it is what it is, the acceptance phase, like that's what's going on there.
For the most part, at least in the YouTube scene, which is primarily what I engage in, you have creators that are new, that are from other games, or they're trying to break in to the MMO scene, and Guild Wars 2 is very accessible to new players. It's free to play. The expansions are cheap, which they should be higher priced altogether for what you get, but they're cheap. It's easy to play. It's a pretty straightforward game system as far as new players are concerned. They don't immediately jump in and do boons, and then they'll do the story, and then they'll just kind of say like, it's a good game, but I'm going to Final Fantasy 14. And then you also have the more in-game community players, which a lot of them they don't really do a lot of community analysis. They don't do, I don't know whether it's just because it doesn't really get that high of viewership or what, but a lot of content creators do content because they want to make something out of it, whether they want to build a community, whether they want to get money, whether they have a goal. And unfortunately, because of the kind of pick up when you want it game style that Guild Wars 2 is, it makes it really hard for creators to kind of stick with it and have things to do, because you can only make so many guides, you can only make so many videos on different things, and once they're out there, I mean, Guild Wars 2 has been out for 12 years. It is a solved game. The same way World of Warcraft is. If you want to know how to do anything in World of Warcraft, there's some video on it from some time period. So with the mid-core players, I feel like a lot of content creators fall into the mid-core just because of how much time content creation takes. That unless you are in a position where it can be your full-time job, similar to the way Preach is, or similar to the way some of the larger multi-game MMO creators are, they have the ability to kind of get into the end game, but they also have the ability to have that kind of streamer or creator privilege that they can get in touch with other players that can kind of fast track their progress as well.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think, Nike was talking about this in the chat. It definitely is a two-way street, right? Like, the community feeds into the content creators as well, right? Like, it's very difficult to, it's very difficult as a creator to kind of maintain energy for the game when, in a lot of ways, people don't really engage with Guild Wars 2 in a way that's kind of conducive to content creation, I guess, if that makes any sense. Which, that's look, I'll just say it. That's obviously, I like content creation, and it's really hard to make content for Guild Wars 2 because in a lot of ways, like, people don't really play the game like super kind of hardcore or very engaged with the game. So there's not really a lot of stuff to actually make about the game. Like, you can talk about issues all the time, but eventually you kind of run out of issues. And the other kind of elephant in the room here as well, this is definitely something that I ran into with Tea Time in particular, is that you end up repeating yourself a lot. Like, it's the same issues.
Yeah.
Like, it's not something different. I think if you go through, if you look at World of Warcraft, right? Like, every single expansion, there's like that one thing that people fucking hate and like scream about, but it's like a different thing, or at least a different flavor of that thing, right? With Guild Wars 2, it's gonna be like, oh yeah, it would be kind of nice if they released more content, huh? And then you kind of keep going over that over and over again, and like, oh yeah, I guess it would be kind of nice if strike missions and raids had difficulty settings. Well, to be fair, we're getting that. Yeah. So, we got there in the end, I guess. Like, we made that happen.
I think I think that one of the critical failures of the Soto marketing was that, like, and it's great for the players, is that they just told you everything on day one. They just said, yeah, this is what you're gonna get, this is what we're gonna do, this is where we're going, and that's it, and then the story was just so poorly written that it didn't engage any of the intrigue. It didn't have any of the speculation. And if you look back at End of Dragons, where they did the like specialization icon teasers, and they said, hey, these are the icons with no context. And then over the course of a few months, they had individual trailers for the different specializations, and then you kind of like check them off the list, and that is stuff that you can make content about, is speculation. Oh, I think this one's going to be thief, I think this one's going to be engineer, this is giving me this is giving me that. And with Janther Wilds, they're doing better with that. I think when the Land Spear teaser dropped, everybody was kind of hype. And then with the, oh, hey, this is a throwback to Guild Wars 1. This requires precise aiming and so on and so forth. I think that things like that give the creators stuff to talk about. And I think that's where you were going with your tea time, is that, like, hey, if there's nothing new to talk about, what are we going to do? Bitch about the LFG again? Like.
Yeah. For sure. It's an interesting situation to be in.
And that's kind of what led to so some of my videos with the reasons why content creators leave, and the reason, or like how to buy raids, those topics came to me because there was nothing else for me to make content about. Yeah. So like I start doing kind of like these meta videos on either game analysis, or just, oh, hey, nobody wants to talk about this, I'll talk about it. Why not?
Yeah, it does tend to go that way. You end up doing things like, oh yeah, let's do Dragon's End with 50 healers, right? Like, that's kind of the the direction it inevitably goes. And I think that the other thing there is that the content release schedule is slow for Guild Wars 2, and at the end of the day, like, it's really weird actually. I think this is something that people actually like about Guild Wars 2, so I want to make that clear before I say this. But one thing that's actually really interesting is that I don't think the game changes that much. Actually, like, especially with the modern expansion kind of setup, like, when a new expansion comes out, it feels like nothing really happened. I definitely felt that with Soto. I'm kind of expecting it to be a little bit less so with Janther Wilds, but there's you know, like it feels like there's not a lot to actually talk about. Like the game does not get heavily impacted by its releases very often. I think that's partially because of, you know, again, like the smaller scale of development compared to other games. But, you know, I think that part of it is also just the game's at a very mature state, right? There's only so much they can actually do to it, right? Like at this point to kind of refresh it in a way. And I think part of it is actually kind of the just the community energy as well. Like when I actually think about this, because I think about this sometimes, you know, like, you know, late at night when, like, okay, I need to like lull myself off to sleep. I think, yes, like Heart of Thorns, the good times, right? But then you think back and you go, well, like, what was it actually like? Like, why was it good? Like, why was HOT and like kind of that era of the game like so exciting? And like a big part of it was basically because everyone was just like the way people played the game was different, right? Like the way people engaged with it was entirely different. Like back then, you know, we would do a tea time every week when there was literally no fucking content, right? I'm pretty sure I actually have tea times like with titles like, yeah, we have nothing to talk about, but we're doing it anyway, right? Like that was kind of like where it wasn't like the content release schedule was actually that different. Not really anyway, in terms of substantive, like the actual amount, it's not super different if we're being real. But like what was different was that it was a very different environment. Like the atmosphere around the game was like super, super different. And it's very difficult to kind of bring that back or recapture that in any way.
So yeah, I was thinking about that too because one of my good coworker friends, he is a big time WoW Classic player. So we're constantly doing this compare and contrast while we're supposed to be at work, and he mentioned that the way Classic gets released is that they release the expansion with kind of the mid-patch balance that they had at the time. And while Guild Wars 2 is a static game, like as far as like they release content and you just get whatever balance is in 2024 for every segment. In Heart of Thorns, the game was much different. You had individual boons and buffs for different classes, things like spotter, things like empower allies, and that changed the way that you formed groups. I mean, you had 10-man boons, you had all sorts of stuff, so you could really push the limits differently. I mean, in Heart of Thorns era, Tempest was like the only DPS anybody wanted to play, right?
Yeah.
But
the good times.
It's yeah.
Staff Ellie is the only good DPS. But look, that's what the Ellie mains want. They want that back. I'm just saying. Like I think, you know, that we could have a go at that. See how that one goes.
Yeah, it's gonna be a all ground targeting spear, ranged spear, all ground targeting.
60k DPS as well. That really is gonna be great.
But I feel like the reason why Heart of Thorns was so interesting is because the game wasn't solved then. Like, I mean, we went from dungeons, and I think if memory serves, the first like Wing 1 clear was using like Heal Core Engineer and stuff like that. It was like weird builds that people were just throwing whatever together and doing pulls to see if they could get it to work. And you know, and then we figured out about Chronomancer, which I know you know all about that. But
it's a good one.
Once people figured the game out, it's really hard to recapture that because we have the god comp. You know, you got heal scourges, you got Condi quickness heralds, and then you got 6 virtuosos. And if you're gonna try to release new content that is challenging for that composition, you're gonna have a bad time. You know what I mean? Like, and at some point, I feel that you need to just focus on the fun aspect of it and let the balance fall by the wayside. And that's what they did in Guild Wars 1 with Urson Way, and it made the game fun. Like, Guild Wars 1 is still fun to play today. And there is a certain amount of fun with challenge, you know, but I think that if you just focus on fun and say like, hey, if it's challenging, it's challenging, that's fine. Like, don't just put a DPS golem in a room and call it a raid, but it needs to be balanced appropriately. Like the sweats are gonna figure it out.
I think it's almost kind of difficult to do that in in the modern gaming atmosphere, though, right? Like, people are obsessed with this, right? Like, the number, it drives people crazy, you know, with like DPS and stuff like that. Like, I think one of the most interesting things that I've ever experienced was back in Path of Fire, when Scourge was kind of the most broken thing in the entire game. People refused to play it because it had like a 5k lower DPS benchmark than other builds, even though it was absolutely game-breakingly broken. People didn't want to play it. That to me is like so interesting, and I think that that's part of the game design equation that isn't immediately obvious, I think, as the player. Like, you know, as a game designer, as a balance dev, you kind of have to balance the game not just around like what's actually good, but what people think is good as well, and like the way people actually play. Which I think it's like really hard, because I in a lot of ways I actually very much agree with you. Like, you know, you can definitely kind of drain the fun out of stuff in the name of balance. We've kind of seen this with Guild Wars 2 a little bit. I think not that much, to be fair, actually, but a little bit, where kind of weird gimmicky abilities have been kind of streamlined down a little bit into more conventional things that aren't as game breaking. Like Heal Scourge is a good example of this. Like the original version of Heal Scourge that got changed recently, or relatively recently anyway, it was fundamentally game breaking. Like, it's just like something like that. It will always be God, and it would never ever change. And you know, it actually really says like how busted it was, that even now it's still kind of busted. Like, even after they really
still is.
They changed it a lot. But the original Heal Scourge was like so unbelievably disgusting, it like defies explanation almost. But you know what? It was fun. Like, that's the thing.
Yeah,
it was fun to play.
Yeah.
So it's really tricky as a game dev, I think, to navigate that.
Yeah, and you know, I'm not gonna sit here and just say wild stuff, because I'm far from a developer, or let alone a full stack developer or game dev or any of these people. But like, I feel like they need to come together with the entire team and determine, like, okay, what is fun, what is marketable, and like, how do we do this? Like, how do we engage with the community and get them engaged, and also provide them what they want? Because just kind of doing whatever they want, or coming up with a little think tank and throwing darts at a dartboard to ideas isn't really it isn't really the way to go about it. I mean, rifts existed before Soto, and they were not popular. So I think that taking that feedback, and I know that they have a high turnover at ArenaNet, you know, there's a pretty young group that work there, but the game's been out for 12 years, and it feels like there's a lot of lessons learned that have happened in the past and that have been corrected, and then they go, you know, an expansion or two ahead of time, and they implement the same problem that they had 3 years prior. And as a creator, you know, you can't really justify it, especially if you've been creating for any length of time, or you've been following for any length of time.
What do you mean by justify it?
Like, you can't, you know,
can't explain
it. Like, yeah, you can't explain it. It's like you go there, you go on live, or you make a YouTube video and you say, "Yep, well, this is what it is, boys. Sorry."
Yeah,
it sucks to suck, right?
It is what it is. Yeah, I do think that it. Well, you know, it's weird, because I feel like, on the one hand, I feel like it always seems that like people love to be negative, but in a way, it's almost incredibly unfun as well. You know, to do that stuff, like, because I 100% know what you're saying, right? Like when it's like, oh yeah, it's scuffed, you hate to see it. It's kind of like, well, you know, I really get why. Again, I think a lot of content creators, and I think they're honestly smart to do this, like, don't really want to engage with this stuff, because it's actually miserable. It's like misery inducing, right? So you just go like, oh, you know, it's gaming. Like, it is what it is. You know,
yeah.
let's blast. You know, let's do stuff. But you know, in a way, I actually think that even makes it kind of worse, because like what's going on there is apathy, right? Like you're essentially saying like, you know, it is what it is, right? Like, whatever. Like, I don't know. Like, and I'm not sure if everyone sees it this way, and I especially don't think that viewers really get this. I think. apathy is so much worse than negativity. I think it's a way harsher kind of emotion to express or feeling to express than negativity. Like, if I was a game dev, I would be horrified if people felt like just, whatever, right? About my video game. I would rather people fucking hate my video game than people feel like, whatever, about this stuff. Because at least they're engaging, right? Like, at least they're saying something, right? You know, if people go on my stream and, you know, like, and go like, oh yeah, you know, your stream is, it's all right, you know, okay, you know, like, blah, yeah, you know, you're doing your thing, like, you know, who cares, right? That is a very grave insult, right? Like, that is like one of the worst responses you could possibly get. Like, holy shit. Like, we're that boring that we're not getting anything done. And, you know, I'm obviously kind of exaggerating to get the point across here, but yeah, it definitely feels bad when, like, a lot of the response is kind of apathetic, right? Like, to a lot of things, like in the content creation scene, or it's like just pretty like, you know, okay, you know, acceptance phase, right? The acceptance phase, it is what it is.
Yeah, and I think that it's bad to see people just in that thing. It's like, oh, I'm just here until a game that I really, really like comes out, you know, or whatever. And you kind of saw it in Diablo 4, where everybody was so hyped with Diablo 4, and then season 1 came out, and then everybody doomed, you know. And it's hard with, you mentioned a kind of a slower content cadence, because if you're going to be playing this game, you know, for 30 plus hours a week or 25 plus hours a week, like, you're going to run out of things to do pretty quick. Like, from a fresh account, I mean, I don't know how long you played your Zero to Hero account, but you got it done pretty quick.
Yeah, I think I think it took me about 1,000 hours to basically beat the game. Like, that's like when that's when I kind of ran out of stuff to do on that account. You know, even now, I do want to do some more stuff on Zero to Hero. I kind of slacked on it. I kind of messed up, I'm being completely honest. Like, you know, I kind of wanted to start it before I was really ready to start it, and that's why, you know, like, I started doing season 3. It kind of fizzled a little bit. Again, that was kind of a miscalculation on my part. But yeah, like a big part was like, oh yeah, holy shit, I beat the game, right? I did it. Yeah. It's over. I did Zero to Hero. I finished it. And that is kind of it's a weird sensation to get to that point, but it does happen, yeah, for sure.
So I'm currently doing a Zero to Hero, and I'm only about 125 hours into it. But what I've seen from critics is that the Zero to Hero playthrough is basically the death rattle for a game in content creation. Like, when content creators run out of things to do, that's when they hit the Zero to Hero button, and then once that's done, it's hard to come back, because, like, I mean, you're literally playing the entire game. You know, you're doing all the guides, you're doing all the things in a single playthrough. And so I would, you know, if I was a dev and I started seeing most of the main content creators that are getting traction doing Zero to Hero runs, be kind of anxious.
You know what's weird? I definitely wasn't in that mind space when I made it. Like, I was, so the problem that I was trying to solve with Zero to Hero was, I wanted, like, a way that I could show people how to solve a lot of issues that they run into, in kind of an entertaining way, hopefully, but also one that I could actually do realistically, because, like, I was definitely in the headspace that, man, I really want to express a lot of complex ideas to people on how to play the game, but holy shit, making videos is hard, right? And it takes a long time, and if I do videos, like scripted videos, it will take me so fucking long. So I need to come up with something that's kind of compelling enough that people will watch it, because it's going to be long, right? If it's not going to be scripted, it's going to be long as fuck, right? And I was thinking, like, what's the way that I can do this in a way that people are going to find interesting, but I can also kind of get the point across, right? And I thought, oh yeah, Zero to Hero, right? Let's go. I was very much inspired by kind of like the RuneScape stuff that people do, right? Yeah. You know, like the challenge accounts. Of course, it's not really a challenge account, but that was the kind of thing that I was looking at. Like, I was looking at the presentation of stuff like Swampletics, right? Like, okay, we could maybe kind of pull something off like this and you know, kind of get something going here. with this. I don't think I was in the headspace of like I'm out of ideas. It was actually like I wanted to compress my ideas, which, you know, in a sense, actually, it was almost related to the, I guess, like the time aspect of it, and like being dedicated to being able to be dedicated to Guild Wars 2 in a way that's realistic, ultimately kind of from an hours in financial standpoint. Like that was like 100% part of the decision as well, right? Like I can't really be grinding like 10 hours of video editing every day. That just doesn't make any sense for me, right? To go about do that. Like the return is not going to justify that. You know, we can get down to brass tacks. I'm totally fine with it. The return is not going to justify that at whatsoever, right? Like, yeah, sure. You know, if it was a full-time situation, right, and like, you know, my job is to basically make like Guild Wars 2 guides, okay, then we can talk about that. That's not the case. So it was also like a little bit of a kind of an economical decision. I actually think it worked out being the best of both worlds, and I think I really I thought it would be good. I definitely like I find with guides are good, right? Like I'm not disrespecting guide content here, but I think that there is something extra powerful about kind of like edutainment style content where people are kind of learning without even realizing that they're learning. You know what I mean? It feels very organic to kind of try and express information that way. So it's almost like I prefer doing stuff like that. Now, whenever I think about doing guides, I think about how can I actually do it in a way like Zero to Hero? How can I do it in a way that's kind of a bit more digestible, a bit more approachable, rather than being bombarded with information? Because you know one thing about guide culture that I find really fascinating? I'd love to hear your take on this, actually. And I want to be super clear. I want to underline this before we get there, because this can definitely come off the wrong way. And I want to 100% say that I don't mean what you might interpret this as. Guide content is great. I think there are some sick-ass guides out there for this content. And I think a lot of people put their heart and soul into them. And I think they're awesome. They're incredibly useful. I think Guild Wars 2 straight up actually has the best guides out of pretty much any MMO. Like, trying to find information about WoW is just straight up more annoying than it is for Guild Wars 2. That is objectively true. The wiki is better than Wowhead. I think a lot of the YouTube stuff is easier to navigate, right? Like, and kind of figure out what's going on. So I want to be 100% clear. I actually think Guild Wars 2 and the Guild Wars 2 community does it better than any other MMO that I have seen. Certainly that I've seen. I've heard Final Fantasy is pretty good, actually, but I haven't played the game. I don't know.
Video is absolutely horrible.
Yeah. So that's the situation with this. It's actually really good here. But one thing that it does concern me a little bit regarding kind of like the guide culture and like the exists in Guild Wars 2 and how much of the content is dedicated that way. I honestly think it kind of makes the game feel really intimidating. There's this atmosphere in the community that people are like, yo, this game is so complex that I have no hope of learning it, right? Like, holy shit, look at all this guide content. This game must be super hard, right? And I think it's actually, in a way, led to this ironic counter effect where the amount of guide content and like the amount of kind of help content out there and like how eager people are to get involved has kind of like convinced people that Guild Wars 2 is like this unassailable mountain that is like super, super difficult. Like I read a lot of comments like this. I get a lot of this in Twitch chat. I get a lot of this on YouTube where people are like, oh, you're doing this, but it feels like it isn't realistic for mere mortals, right? Like, and it's like, man, and I feel compassion for that. Like, I don't find that funny, right? To be clear, I don't find that like, ha ha ha, look at this noob, right? It's very much, shit, we've got a problem here. Like if this player is feeling kind of intimidated and they're feeling some anxiety about approaching the content, something's gone wrong, right? A little bit with this. That shouldn't be how it is. Because, obviously, as with all things, the game has a skill cap, and you can be really good at the game, right? And, it's obviously hard to get to, top level, but it's 100% approachable, right? Like, it absolutely is, like, a very approachable thing that I think that can be achieved by anyone if they kind of want to get into that kind of stuff. And I do think that part of, like, the Guild Wars 2 content creation culture has kind of fed into that in a kind of a very unintentional way. What do you think about that?
So, yeah, I think that in a couple of my videos, I've kind of expressed a get in where you fit in type of mentality. Even in the how to buy raids, video. Yeah. I ended it with like, hey, if you want to play with ultra sweats, then do it, and if you don't, then do that. Like, in my how to get gold video, it was like you can get gold literally doing anything. That was the final note. Like, hey, just play the game. That's how you get gold. And I feel like the amount of guides that are available. I feel like the size of the Guild Wars community is not really reflected in the viewership of content creation, and I feel that maybe that's because people are seeing like, hey, if you type in Guild Wars 2 guide into YouTube, you have 18 million guides, and they're just getting turned off from playing it. But I feel like a large amount of the player base doesn't really engage with any guides at all. They just kind of stumble around, and then unless they have an achievement or something that they're looking for, they usually don't engage with it. I mean, there's really no it does I don't see it reflected in the analytics, you know? But I feel that it definitely can turn people off. I know that I mentioned that BDO is horrible with their wiki and their guides, and that's a pretty complex game, you know. And if you, it's kind of like a damned if you do, damned if you don't type of situation. I think that for some people, they say, "Oh wow, look at all these resources. This is awesome. Like I can literally do anything." And then other players, they just feel like, holy crap, like I have to watch 10 YouTube videos to do this thing.
Yeah, and that's why I kind of, that was definitely part of the thought process when I was kind of thinking about Zero to Hero, because I feel like that type of expression and information explanation kind of can make it feel a little bit less like school, I guess almost,
Yeah,
right? Like where you have to learn all this stuff.
Well, definitely.
Yeah, like
And at least my series is far less successful than yours has been. But for the most part, I've seen a lot of people show a lot of interest and say like, "Oh,
Yeah.
I'm really glad you're showing this because, at 125 hours in, I have the Sky Scale, I have the Griffin, I have the Roller Beetle, I have all of these things that a lot of people will work years and years towards, and it's like, hey, listen, like if you just, didn't focus on a task that you want to accomplish, then it's very doable by everyone. It's just a matter of saying like, hey, when I log in today, I'm gonna work on this collection, or I need to hit this meta. What time does that meta happen? And it's not a complicated thing, and I feel like that's why a lot of new players go to Guild Wars 2, is because it is not a very complicated game at the casual level. It only becomes complicated and irritating once you start getting into boon management and all of that stuff. So, and I mean UI and everything you've already discussed, 15 times in the last 3 months, So it's, I feel that with guides, it can be very valuable, but it can also, it doesn't need to be a turnoff, I guess. And I think you're right that Zero to Hero does a good job of explaining that. For me, my motivation, even though I did say it was like kind of the death thrall for the game in terms of a content creator's eyes, my motivation was to kind of highlight how you go about getting certain things from a fresh account, and showing that you don't need a doctorate to play the game.
No, I'm completely with you actually on this one, because I've almost become slightly obsessed with this actually over the last year, weirdly enough, because I've seen rotations basically get easier and easier. Like builds like Condi Weaver, yeah, fair enough. That used to be, that's a bit of a rotation now. I'll give you that, but it's really not hard anymore. Like it really isn't. With a lot of these DPS builds, like, the game has been getting easier, certainly from like a rotational complexity standpoint, with the odd exception of like some absolute lunatic shit like Deadeye, right? Like before anyone points that out, right? But in general, it really ain't that bad. anymore, if I'm being real. And I'm in this constant, like, mental battle. Like, am I wrong about this? You know, like, what's going on here? I get really confused when, you know, when people are like, oh man, I'm super intimidated by this. And I want to be clear, I believe them. Like, I don't go, oh, just don't feel that way, forehead, right? Like, that's a stupid engagement with anyone who's saying that. I go like, oh shit, man, like, I want to help, right? You know, I want to help you play your class. It's why I get really, really kind of nervous when people say stuff like, oh yeah, don't play Ellie as a new player, bro. Oh no, there's no way you can handle it. You'll be fucking fine, right? Okay, like, you're like, play your Ellie, play your wizard, okay? Like, you will be able to learn and play the game. I just really hate the idea that some players kind of look at a play style or like a build they want to play and go, I can't do it, right? Because that makes me sad.
That's one thing that I'm actually guilty of, is turning people away from playing Ellie. And the reason why I do so is not because of it's too complex, bro, like you'll never be able to handle it. It's that I feel like in the current balance, the state of balance in the game, is that pretty much everything overshadows it. You know what I mean? It's like, right now, if you think healer, you're not thinking heal temp. You know, you might consider it for certain fights, but as a new player that doesn't know any of the fights, doesn't know anything about the game or how, you know, group compositions work, heal temp probably isn't where you want to be to start with. You know, and that is kind of what my motivation is for saying, like, hey, you probably don't want to start with Elementalist, is because, like, yeah, some of the DPS rotations are all right. We got into kind of a DPS question on Sneb's podcast yesterday, where I basically said that for me as a mid-core player, if I was commanding a group of pugs and I saw all 6 of my DPS players pulling 25k in an encounter, regardless of what build they were on, I'd be completely fine with that. That is a-okay. And everybody was just kind of like, no, there's so much more potential and you shouldn't settle with that, and so on. But when it comes down to it, it's like you don't even need 25k to clear these bosses, and that was also brought up too. But when it comes to builds and rotations and stuff like that, I feel like a lot of this guide content does a good job of explaining these builds to people. I don't know if people would actually figure it out on their own without a lot of explanation. I'm sure some people do. Like, some people, they make their own build and they run it, you know, and it works. But it's really about that transition that we were talking about. Like, how do you get a guy who just downloaded the game and has 100 hours in and hasn't done anything in the game yet, to somebody that understands how to properly build a character to its maximum potential? You know, and realistically, I feel like a lot of Guild Wars 2 players don't even care about getting to that level.
I think that most players in all games don't care, to be honest. Like, I think this is, I think the amount of people who actually kind of want to, like, you know, really kind of get into it when it comes to, like, stuff like the combat system of any game, it's pretty minimal, realistically. Like, not many people want to go that way. They want to blast and have fun, right? Like, that's kind of like the goal, I think, of pretty much all players. You know, this is an interesting one. You know, I don't think that your goal is ever to get people to do that. I think the goal should always be, it should be easy to do that if you want to, right? So, in other words, if a player wants to learn and if a player wants to kind of understand the game should not obfuscate that information from you in any way. It should be easy to do that, right? Like, I'm not saying that your goal should be to make everyone do that. It should be that if people want to learn, they want to engage, then there's no barriers. Like, you minimize the barriers that are placed in your way, essentially, in order to do that. And I think, yeah, Guild Wars 2 is a bit weird in this regard. I think that there's a couple of things about the game that aren't immediately obvious. I think the UI doesn't help with that. It's mostly UI concerns I have, like, in this regard. I think when it comes to, like, new players, like, kind of understanding the nuances of the combat system. But yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a goal that everyone knows how the game works. I think the goal is that if players want to, then they can. I think one thing you can do is through gameplay as well. Like, you'll notice that a lot of the new weapons, right, they have this kind of builder-spender design, like internal mechanic design attached to them. I think stuff like that is really good. And I'll tell you why. If you want to... If you play another MMO, and I was actually talking to someone who played Final Fantasy, actually, and we were kind of chatting about some of this stuff. We were chatting about WoW and Guild Wars and MMOs and all this kind of stuff. And they said that it's really good that in games like WoW and Final Fantasy 14... you can kind of figure out the optimal rotation, right? Like, the optimal rotation kind of falls out, if that makes any sense, of, like, the class design. Like, it's designed from the top down a lot of the time, right? The devs basically said, this is the rotation that you're going to do, right? And then they prescribe it to the players in a lot of ways. In Guild Wars 2, it's kind of not like that. It's very much, here's some random skills. Do a rotation with it, guys. And I think that, like, inherently makes the game a lot more opaque to new players, because... realistically, outside of doing extensive testing and some spreadsheeting, it's not immediately obvious, like, how you're actually supposed to play the game, right? I think, or how you're supposed to play your class anyway. Certainly from a PvE, like, rotational perspective, yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely not, and I mean, it's. I don't want to say it's fairly recent, but it was something that was kind of born from the raids in Heart of Thorns. Because prior to that, I mean, your regular dungeon run, AC P1 through 3, clears and stuff like that. Nobody knew anything about a rotation. I just use 100 blades, or I just use this skill. And so whenever I guess in other tab targeting MMOs, it's a little bit more straightforward, where you just have, like, oh, you just press this button and then it goes on cooldown for 3 minutes, and then you press this other button in the meantime. With Guild Wars and its more fast-paced combat style, you end up needing to figure it out, and then you're like, okay, like, where do I get my damage modifiers from? What boons do I need to proc these traits? And you're basically, adding a multiplier on top of a multiplier on top of a multiplier to get the numbers that you want. And then the new content that comes out, you're kind of stuck in a place because the new content requires that, or requires some amount of that. And so you can't really ever go back because the players know how to do it. And so if you balance for the players if you balance the encounter for the players that are just going to go in and press 1 and then press 2 and then never weapon swap and then press 1 and press 2, then the players that do know how to min-max and do know how to rotate and do know how to get the maximum DPS modifiers, it's just gonna be a wet paper bag, and so it's a very hard question to answer, and I feel like it will be answered with the difficulty scaling. I would love to see the HP pools drop. You should not need to be rotating for 5-10 minutes on a boss, especially an open world encounter, to get the clear. It feels like rotations are becoming more and more critical to some of these encounters, which is unfortunate in my opinion, because it does take away from the fun.
I mean, yeah. I think that some of this, though, is actually kind of just the encounter design maybe not being super hot. Like, I think we're kind of... You're kind of talking about Epoch, right? A little bit? The open world
Yeah,
boss?
well, between... and in Fractals as well.
Oh, yeah,
Epoch in both cases.
Yeah. I think that's kind of... Like, the Fractal one is, like, a really interesting one, because it's kind of like a strike mission, basically. I do think the HP is too difficult there. I think they have a slightly difficult time determining, like, how they want the content to be difficult, in a sense. And I think the fractal thing, there's something, I have a bit of a theory on this, that I feel like they have a bit of a time budget for each fractal. Like, a fractal needs to take a certain amount of time, basically. They don't want it to be over in, like, 3 minutes. And, yeah, if they had Epoch with an appropriate amount of HP, it would be literally the shortest fractal in the game. That's probably something they didn't want to do. Like, again, I don't think that... Like, I don't think there's any kind of like good solution now. I think when it came to that fractal, when it came to shipping it, ain't it, we're in a bit of a rock and a hard place, if I'm being honest. Like, I'm not sure how you make that. I'm not sure how you make that good. If I'm being completely real with you, it's very difficult with working with what they had, I guess. But on like, kind of like the open world stuff, I definitely agree that like having DPS checks in open world is like a bit like whatever. But I do think it is useful to have a DPS check that is failable, even if it doesn't fail very often. Like, for example, let's say it fails,
Sure.
if it fails like 10% of the time. I actually think that's a pretty good thing to have, because look at what happened with Epoch. It 100% prompted people to actually think about the game a bit more. In the LFG, you see we're doing subs, we're doing quickness, we're doing alacrity, right?
Yeah,
I think stuff like that, that prompts people to kind of have a little bit of a think, I think is good. I think the reason why Epoch, people are really like, man, I hate the fact that this is kind of like a DPS golem, is because the fight isn't good. Like, for example, I would compare this to Dragon's End, right? And I will just say this, yeah, Dragon's End was probably a little bit too extreme on launch. I had like a 90% fail rate. That's probably not good for open world. I will 100% grant you that. However, it got people engaged. Right? Like, it got people to engage with the game, and I think that is something that is good, because Guild Wars 2 has always been reliant on this, and this is one of my least favorite kind of community developments that's happened over time. The game's community has become more and more separated. Like, back in the day, players of different skill levels and experience levels would mix a lot. In the open world, even in pugs. That's why I hate the fact that the pug scene is dead in Guild Wars 2. Because pugs are so important. Like, you know, in Heart of Thorns and Apathy, you'd see QTSC members, IVT members, ES members, all these top guilds. Where were they? They were in pugs, right? And you go, holy shit, this guy's blasting. That's cool, right? And I think it had such a positive effect on information transference, right? Like with players learning from each other. And the thing is, that's such an important thing in Guild Wars 2. It's like the backbone of the game, like, is everyone ends up in the open world. Everyone's doing chat Garen, right? Look, you know, some of the people who do these meta events most religiously, they're in hardcore guilds. I'm serious, by the way. 100%. They're in these speedrunning guilds. And, you know, that information transference is so cool. And the fact that players kind of tend to silo themselves off more these days, I think is so unfortunate. And that's why I do kind of like it when the game does give you a bit of a nudge. And again, I don't think it has to fail very often. And again, I don't think Epoch fails super often now. I've heard some reports on NA, it's a bit worse, but people meme NA, so I have no idea to believe people or not. Like, on this stuff.
I've only done Epoch, I think, twice, and it was horrible. So I just was like, all right, well, back to the content I was doing 5 years ago, you know. But I just feel like the balance should be more towards, like what you said, encounter design with mechanics that are punishing, and then that way you can drop that health pool down. So that way it's like, okay, we'll burn him, but if we make a mistake or if we stand in bad, it's like, back to the waypoint you go, buddy. Like, it's kind of the opposite. It's where they put a timer on it, they give it a ton of health, and then all of the mechanics you can just ignore. You know, and that's kind of, it should be reversed. You know, it should be the mechanics that you have to engage with, and then give the HP a break. You know.
Yeah, no, I agree. Or at least, again, like, break it up and segment it off.
Yeah.
But I am aware that you've got a dash. Okay, so
I do.
Let's go ahead and wrap things up. It was honestly a super interesting conversation. I hope we can have many more like that. I think I've got a lot more to talk about for sure. I could go on for ages. I'm sure you could as well. So I want to say a massive thank you for coming on. I really hope to have you like on Tea Time on the show and just hanging around on the stream. Basically whatever, you know, it's really awesome to meet new people, and I actually want to say that I really appreciate you because it, you know, it's a little bit lonely out here. Like, you know, I'm kind of struggling. You know, I look at my tea time hosts, right? It's the same 4 people, right? Like, you know, like, who I feel like have got like pretty strong opinions and, you know, kind of got something to say, right? Like about the game, but are pretty invested. So it's honestly a real treat to encounter, you know, some new characters. I really want to thank you for that. And of course, let us know about, you know, where we can find you. We can spam some links in the chat to get that going as well. And yeah, any kind of final thoughts before if we go our separate ways, at least for the time being? And once again, thank you very much for coming on.
Well, I appreciate it, Teapot. And yeah, I am literally just on YouTube. I do have a killer video coming out here. It's in the works. I can't say when. I can't say when. I do upload weekly Teapot or weekly Teapot, weekly 0 to Hero videos. That's kind of like my standard weekly dose of Silhouette, and then I do more meta commentary. And I got one that's pretty meta coming up that I think I think Teapot will enjoy thoroughly. So
very nice.
And yeah, I appreciate the invite, and I would be glad to be back, assuming my family warrants it. So with that, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. It was an absolute pleasure. Have a wonderful day. Sure, I'll see you around. Take it easy, my friends. I'll see you later.